So, episode three, I've decided to start doing episodes so I can upload them to YouTube, episode one, episode two, etc. So, today we're talking about hardware. So, things like what's in the box under your desk. We're going to go through the different components within. We're going to have a discussion about Intel. Do I go for an i3, an i5, or an AMD? We'll be looking at SSD and HDDs and discuss what the differences are. We'll be discussing CD and DVD ROM drives, um, and then we're going to ask the question to GPU or not to GPU. I'll also cover quite quickly PCIe cards, which will give you. I'll give you some more information later on what they do and things like that. And then we're also going to check our own machines to make sure we're not overworking them too much. So inside the box. Now, this is a pretty typical sort of PC box. They're all very different though, but they all have the same sort of components in them. They're all going to have a motherboard, which is on this image, the blue board in the background. And it's called a motherboard because everything connects back to it. So whenever any of us are ever in trouble, we've got something exciting to say, we always go back to our mums and tell them. Same principle with a PC. We have a PSU, which is a power supply unit that provides different voltages and different connections to all the different ports on the motherboard and on your hard drives and PCIe cards and anything like that. You have a CPU, which is your central processing unit. And the easiest way to sort of explain that is that's basically the brain where it throws information backwards and forwards, processing it, thinking about it. You've got RAM, which is random access memory. To continue with the human body analogy, that is basically short-term memory. It's what you've been thinking about recently, and it's what you're going to carry on thinking about in the short term. You potentially have an SSD, which is a solid state drive. You may also just have a hard drive. Depends generally on the age of your machine, but they're basically long-term storage. That's where everything is stored when your PC switched off. Same principle with the brain. When you're asleep, everything's stored in your hard drive. We have DVD and CD drives. There is a bit more of a discussion coming up about that because to some people, they're deemed very old technology now. To some people, they're deemed still quite modern and relevant. We're also going to talk about GPU, which is the graphics processing unit. There is a conversation to be had about them because not everybody needs one. Some people do need one and don't realize it, but it really depends what you need. And that is the video card that you can see here on this camera, on this photo, sorry. And then we're going to talk about the PCIe slots, which are these white slots down here, where you can plug a variety of different components in to customize your machine to make it do what you need it to do. So, Intel or AMD? So now we're talking CPUs. The majority of processors that are in desktop and laptop PCs are going to be made by Intel or AMD. They're the two big players in the market. When you come down to mobile devices, you tend to get other manufacturers coming in, but they're designed to do different things, run different operating systems. So it's not often you'll come across a desktop or a laptop that's got something other than an Intel or an AMD processor in it. So if you're using your machine for business, I personally would recommend an i3, an i5, or an i7. They're all made by Intel. They're pretty good processors. If the higher the number, the more expensive it's going to be, but generally the more capable it is. AMD, if you're doing graphical work, they're even better. Just the way they process the data and the way they have a small GPU basically built onto the processor makes them much better for graphics. You'll find them in a lot of gaming machines. You'll find a lot of them, a lot of graphics cards, GPUs will have AMD-based processors in them. They're very good at that. I would definitely advise to avoid all cheap and low-cost processors for work. If it's an Intel Pentium, don't touch it. If it's an AMD A6, whatever, don't touch it because they're just not very good, to be honest. There's a lot of, it's very easy to go out to PC World and buy a laptop for say £300 and it'll have an Intel Pentium processor or an Intel Atom processor in it. And although they're very clever bits of kit, they're just not cut out for use in a business environment. Maybe on a home machine, fair enough. Personally, I won't sell anybody anything below an i3 processor. And there is a website called CPU Boss where you can compare all sorts of different processors. So if you find one that you like, run it through a comparison, compare it to the nearest AMD, and it will tell you which one is going to be better depending on what you want it to use it for. Most Intel processors have a thing called turbo boost, so they will overclock themselves. As an example, the 11th generation i5 processor that my laptop has a base clock speed of 2.4 gigahertz. That's the speed that it throws data backwards and forwards across the processor, processing it. Now, that can turbo boost itself up to 3.5 gigahertz. So it's for short periods of time, generally, to process something when it's got a lot going on, get it done nice and quick, and then it goes back down. AMDs can do a similar thing, but they tend to have an overheating issue, which is quite unfortunate. If you are going to overclock your machine, speak to a professional if you're going to do that. If it's something like turbo boost that's built in, it will be safe. AMDs work on a smaller technology, 7 nanometers compared to Intel's 10 nanometers for the silicon chips built into your processor, and they are generally more energy efficient. So they will cost you less to run. It is a trade-off. They're generally, in my opinion and my experience, they're not as good as the equivalent Intel processors, unless you want to do graphics. Then they sort of become better. And I think the cost in running per year is going to be negligible. They're all low powered processors, 55 watts, 75 watts for some of the top end these days. Intel support multiple cores and threads. AMD do a similar thing on their Threadripper processors, which are very good processors, but they are very expensive. But basically, they reached a limit, and quite a number of years ago, that they can't make processors clock any faster than about 5.5 gigahertz. The technology doesn't exist to make them go faster. It is a natural barrier we've come across. So to get over that, they've gone, well, we'll take that processor and we'll put 2 CPUs on that one chip. Great. So it can now do 2 lots of processing at the same time. They've taken it one step further with sort of the 6th and the 7th generation Intel processors onwards, where they now do multi-threading. So you have one physical chip in your machine, but there's 4 individual cores in there. So that's great, can do 4 things at once. But with the multi-threading, that enables each one of those processors to do 2 tasks at a time. So it's in essence now an 8-core machine. So it can do 8 different processes all at the same time without tripping up and getting stuck. If you're doing a lot of gaming and things like that, anything that's quite sort of processor intensive, multi-cores and multiple threads is the way to go. I think the limit is something like 128 chips that you can have with Intel. With AMD, it's a bit more than that. I think it's 1,000 and something. I'm not 100% sure of it, but those sort of super powered machines, none of us are ever going to be able to touch or look at, and they'll be locked away somewhere. But that's definitely something bearing in mind. If you're doing a lot of business applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, a bit of web browsing and things like that, it's probably better for you to go for a processor such as the Intel i3 10th generation that clock at 3.7 gigahertz, but they've only got 4 cores and 4 threads. They don't have the multi-threading capability. That is probably going to work a lot faster for you than, say, going for an Intel i5 that only clocks at, say, 1.2 gigahertz, but has that multi-core ability, because you're not actually going to be using that. I think it's 99.9998% of processing or processors are sitting there twiddling their thumbs. It's not very often that we actually make a processor work hard. So moving on from that, the next thing we're going to talk about is SSD or HDD. So here's a selection of some of them. HDD, which is a hard disk drive, like the photo here in the middle, the Seagate drive, and the Toshiba one down the bottom right. The difference between them is one of them is a desktop hard drive and the other one is a laptop hard drive. Now, they store all your data. As mentioned at the start, it's like your long-term memory. They're considered slow and power hungry because they work a bit like a record player. There's platters in there that it has to spin up to speed and then uses a magnet to search that drive to find the information that you've requested. They're prone to physical issues because of this. So if you knock them, I think a lot of them can survive somewhere around 140 Gs. And okay, humans can't survive beyond about 15 Gs. So 140 sounds like an awful lot. But when you bear in mind those platters are spinning at 7,200 RPM, that's turning over faster than the engine of your car. So as soon as you knock that, all of a sudden the forces that are in play within that box are huge. So some of the advantages of going for an SSD is still store all your data, but they're a lot more power efficient because there's no physical motor, there's no physical spinning, there's no physical movements that need to be done, and they can take a beating. Some of them can take over 1,000 G-force before they break. So if you drop them, doesn't matter generally. Whereas a normal hard drive, if you drop it, you're knackered. So this integral V series SSD is generally the sort that you'll find in a laptop or in a desktop that's had an SSD fitted or an upgrade or came with the factory. The photo of the Crucial in the top right hand corner, that is an SSD, and that's a more modern SSD, which uses an M2 SATA socket. Now, there's a few different sockets out there that you can get these in different sizes and different capacities and things, but most laptops these days and a lot of desktops are coming with these in them. They're a lot smaller, so they're generally a lot. They're more expensive to buy, but as with anything like hard drives, the longer the technology's been out, the better it is, the cheaper it becomes. So a normal 1 terabyte hard drive is going to cost you probably somewhere around 35, 40 quid. A 1 terabyte SSD is probably going to cost you around the 90 quid mark. It is a lot of money, but they are a lot faster and a lot more reliable. So if you've got an older machine, 3 or 4 years, and you don't want to buy a new one because you haven't got the money or anything like that, an SSD is probably the best thing you can do for it because it's so much faster than a traditional drive, and it will give you another couple of years of breathing space before you then have to upgrade again. So CDs and DVD drives, I do wanted to talk about them because a lot of people would consider them old technology. But I still remember the days of having a tape player, and I've still got a collection of records in my loft. So yes, they're sort of modern, but they're sort of old. These days, with the advent of fast internet connections and things like that, we tend to download everything. It's all there at the touch of a button and things. So we don't really own physical copies anymore. So what you'll find is that most new machines won't have a CD or DVD drive in them. Even if you go for custom build gaming machines and things like that now, generally they still don't have drives in them. You can, however, get USB powered CD and DVD drives. So if you do ever need one, you can get your hands on one. So do you remember the days of CD-ROM? Do you know ROM stands for read-only memory? Yeah. When they come out with all these DVD and CD writers, then it was writers and then it was rewriters because you could write to the CD more than once. All of that is in the past now. We don't generally do that. Everything is done over the internet and so on. But believe it or not, we used to use magnetic tapes for things. So yeah, I've still got quite a few VHS up in the loft, and I know some companies, some rather large companies, that are still backing all their data up on reel-to-reel magnetic tapes, which is yeah, quite a very old technology. It's older than me, that sort of stuff. So to GPU or not to GPU. So your graphics processor generally has one thing to do, which is process your graphics. So if you're interested in having a zoom background, believe it or not, they don't really care what GPU you have. They're not really fussed whether you've got a big graphics card, a small graphics card, or no graphics card. They care more about the processor because the processor is the one that's actually putting the virtual background on. So one thing to bear in mind when you're looking for processors, most of the Intel i3 processors are not supported by Zoom, whereas the i5s and the i7s are. So if you do want virtual backgrounds, a bit like the one I've got behind me, or if you want video capabilities, you need to go for at least an i5 with Intel. If you want to watch high definition videos, most of the onboard graphics, Intel Iris, etc., or Intel integrated graphics, is going to be perfectly fine for watching high definition videos. High definition generally is anything 4 megapixels and above, believe it or not. So most built-in graphics cards will do fine. If you want to edit videos, having a graphics card will definitely help. It will give you better qualities, slower wait times while it's buffering and things like that. That being said, that only goes so far because the processor is still the one that's doing a lot of the work. So if you are editing videos, having a graphics card and a better processor is the way to go. Now, if you want to have multiple multiple monitors, you're going to need a graphics card. Most motherboards, by default, when you plug one monitor in, turn off any other ports. Plug your HDMI in or turn the VGA off, because all they want to do is run their one screen. Now, the graphics cards, for example, I've got one in my tower here that is probably about 10 years old. It's only a 1 or a 2 gig NVIDIA 730, I think it is, or 710 GT. It's a very basic card. It's about 35 quid, and it runs 2 monitors absolutely fine. You don't have to necessarily spend lots of money on these things. If you do want to play games, and if FPS, frames per second, are important to you, you're going to need quite a big, powerful graphics card. A lot of people care about frames per second because they want to play their game at 108 frames per second. The human eye can only pick up 30 frames per second. So realistically, if it's doing any more than 30 frames a second, you're probably not going to notice. So it's worth bearing in mind, because of the pandemic and ongoing issues, graphics cards are very expensive now. Very expensive. So you may have a wait if you do want to get one. So PCIe cards, that's an interface, and there's a couple of different sorts of interfaces because they're on PCI 2.0 and 3 and all of that. And some of them have got 16 connections, some of them have got 32 connections. Generally, everything these days is going to be backwards compatible. So even if you had a first generation card, it's most likely to work in your current desktop. But they do all sorts of weird and wonderful things for you. So if you want additional USB ports, you can get a PCIe card that will give you an extra 4 or more USB ports in the back. Graphics cards all run off of the PCIe express ports. Built-in Wi-Fi, you can get Wi-Fi cards to go in. They'll do the same thing. If you want to use serial or parallel ports, there's really old type of connections for printers and things like that. You can still get cards that have those connections on. You can have additional SATA ports, so you can connect multiple drive or more drives inside your box. If you don't have enough, you can connect mSATA drives to them. I've got one in my box here that's got 2 mSATA drives connected to it, which means I can boot my machine off of one of them, and then I've got access to the other one if I want to duplicate, copy, add additional storage, etc. We can do that sort of thing with it. Networking cards. Most PCs will have a card built on to the motherboard to be able to deal with an Ethernet connection. But you can, if you're really into your gaming, or if you need multiple internet connections to one machine, then you can have that as well by adding additional cards and sound cards as well. If you're seriously into recording music and things like that, you're going to want a dedicated sound card to get the highest quality you possibly can. So let's have a look at how your systems are running. So this little picture here is of a thing called Task Manager. Now this is Windows heavy. I do apologize, but there is Resource Monitor in the Mac machines if you happen to be going down the Apple route. So check your Task Manager out. And you can do that by a number of ways. You can whack the start button and type in Task Manager. You can right click on your start button and select Task Manager in the list, or you can do Control Shift Escape, and that will load your Task Manager as it is done here. Now you've got a variety of options down the side here that you can go and have a look at to see what's doing what, and we'll just go through a few things. So you want to look mostly at your CPU, your memory, and your disk. So if you look on this screenshot here, you can see my CPU is up and down, up and down, up and down. Well, that's fine. It's not working too hard. It's not struggling at any point. You can see the memory is sitting there at 95%. So that means that I probably need to upgrade the amount of memory, which is RAM, that I've got in my PC, because I'm getting near to that limit. My disk is sitting at 4%. So that's basically twiddling its thumbs as well. So as it says on here, high usage isn't always a sign of a problem. It might just mean you're doing something. If you, for argument's sake, decided to export a video that you just created, you'll find most of your resources are going to go your disk, your memory, and your CPU. They're going to go right up to 90+%, if not 100%. And it will sit there while it's working hard getting that done. The more powerful processor you have, the more memory you have, etc., etc. Generally, the faster those processes are going to happen. But it's one of those trade-offs between, do you need it when 99.9% of the time it's sitting there doing nothing? Is it worth all that expense to have all that power just for that 0.1% of the time you're going to use it? So yeah. And the other thing is low usage is another thing to bear in mind. Doesn't mean that your PC is going to be strong or powerful enough when you do want to use it. So, as an example, I had a client and they had a machine. Well, they had a series of machines, and they're of the opinion they sit there doing nothing most of their lives, these computers. And I agree, they do. They sit there doing nothing because they're not being worked particularly hard. A lot of the time, people are out doing other things outside of the office, so they're not on their machines. But when they do want to use them, all of a sudden their resources are up to 100% capacity. And they sit there going, well, can't do anything because I'm waiting on my PC. So, yes, a lot of the time they're sitting there doing nothing. But when you need them, when you're really counting on them, are they strong enough to do what you need them to do? It's always something worth bearing in mind. So, and it's something that you can check out. And if somebody turns around and says to you, oh, that's fine, we'll just put more RAM in it and that'll make it faster, not always the case. Because a lot of the time, if you're looking at a PC that has got an HDD instead of an SDD in it, SSD, sorry, you will notice generally the disk is going to be sitting up at 100% usage while the RAM is sitting there doing nothing. The slowest, a PC is only as fast as its slowest part. And quite often that is the internet or the hard drive. Everything else is designed to run as fast as it possibly can. So upgrading from an HDD to an SSD can make a world of difference to your machine.